looks like something I would buy.
Yeah, it definitely does.
Well, first we're gonna get the D6 attached to the frame. This is gonna get attached to the trommel, and the 220's excavator is gonna get attached to the trommel.
Tony Beets, big gamble. Can a rusted relic save his gold mine? Deep in the Yukon wilderness, Tony Beets stumbled upon a rusted, abandoned trommel, and inside, something unexpected. Gold. No one saw it coming, but this discovery came at a high cost. Tony had already lost nearly $1 million after his prized Viking dredge burst into flames. His once thriving gold mining operation was crumbling, and he was running out of options. With winter closing in and everything on the line, Tony took a massive risk, gambling on an old 30-year-old machine that had been left to rot in the wild. It was a desperate move that could either save his operation or sink it forever. A rusted relic, a risky bet. Tony spent over $400,000 on a trommel that hadn't run in years. And as if that wasn't risky enough, it had been abandoned deep in the Yukon. But with no other choices left, he had to believe this forgotten hunk of metal could turn his luck around. His entire gold mining dream was built around the Viking dredge, a powerhouse machine that once filtered gold from mountains of dirt in the Klondike rivers. But even the best machines break down. And then, disaster struck. A crushing blow. One day, the Viking dredge caught fire, and in an instant, Tony's operation took a devastating hit. No one was hurt, but the damage was beyond simple repairs. Fixing it would cost a fortune, and time wasn't on his side. With no choice but to move on, Tony turned to dredge number 1, an even older machine. But that wasn't much better. Constant breakdowns, costly repairs, and sinking investments made it clear that this wasn't a long-term solution. He needed something reliable, something that could bring in the gold. Now, all his hopes rest on this forgotten trommel. Will this rusted relic be the key to turning his luck around? Or will it be the final nail in the coffin for his operation? Join Tony's journey as he battles against time, the harsh Yukon winter, and the toughest odds yet to strike gold once again. Tony Beets' toughest battle, a sunken dredge, a rusted relic, and one last shot at gold things went from bad to worse. One of Tony's dredges didn't just sink once, it went down twice in a matter of weeks. His operation was falling apart, and every plan he made seemed to backfire. That same dredge had once been legendary, pulling over 1 million ounces of gold in the late 1930s. But its glory days were long gone. Now, it was clogging, leaking, and sinking like a rock. Tony needed a miracle. And then, he found one. A rusted relic in the Yukon wilderness. Deep in the Yukon, forgotten and left to rust, was an abandoned mobile trommel, a 35-ton behemoth of metal, wheels, and untapped potential. It had been built by a lone miner 30 years ago, used for just one season, and then left to rot. But Tony saw something others didn't: opportunity. With gold prices rising and his dredges falling apart, he made a bold move, spending $400,000 to bring this old machine back to life. Unlike his stationary dredges, this trommel was mobile, meaning it could move from site to site and keep his operation running. It was his new golden hope. A dangerous mission. Hauling a 35-ton giant buying the trommel was the easy part. Getting it out of the wilderness? That was the real challenge. The massive machine was sitting in Moose Creek, and Tony's crew had to haul it over 100 miles of rough mountain roads to bring it back to camp. His youngest son, Mike, led the charge. But the journey was anything but smooth. First, they had to load it onto a ferry, a risky move, considering their truck was over 80 feet long. If the ferry couldn't handle the weight, they'd have no choice but to take the long way around, an exhausting 200-mile detour. To make it possible, they had to break the trommel down piece by piece. The conveyor came off first, then the sluice box, and finally, the 20-ton drum, the heaviest part. But every single day brought new obstacles, equipment failures, dangerous terrain, and exhaustion. At one point, the trommel nearly tipped over, almost crushing a crew member. The stress was relentless, and everyone knew one wrong move could mean disaster. A hard-fought victory. After an intense battle against the elements, they finally got the trommel out of the wilderness. They loaded it onto a military-grade transporter and started the treacherous journey back to camp. But the struggle wasn't over. Rough roads, deep mud, and unpredictable weather made the trip nerve-wracking. More than once, the truck tilted dangerously to one side, its wheels lifting off the ground. By sheer luck and skill, they managed to keep it from flipping over. A new beginning? Once they reached camp, Tony gathered his crew. He knew they had just pulled off something incredible. They may not have found any gold in those 3 brutal days, but that trommel could change everything. Tony was betting big on this machine to bring his operation back to life and finally put an end to the costly downtime that had plagued him since the Viking dredge went down. Tony Beets' big gamble. Can this machine change everything? This trommel wasn't just another piece of equipment. It was a game changer. Unlike the old dredges, this machine was faster, mobile, and far more efficient. Once up and running, it could process massive amounts of material in record time, leading to more gold with less effort. Tony knew this was his best shot at turning things around, and he wasn't about to waste it. But in gold mining, nothing comes easy. For Tony, this wasn't just about hitting the jackpot. It was about building a long-term, reliable mining operation that could withstand the brutal challenges of the Yukon. That's why he put everything on the line to get the trommel working. He wasn't just thinking about the next big payday. He was thinking about the future, a controversial reputation. Of course, Tony's rough, no-nonsense style has always been controversial. His leadership is tough, and not everyone is a fan of his hardcore approach. One of his most infamous moments came when a member of his crew dumped gasoline into a dredge pond and set it on fire. What was meant as a harmless joke turned into serious legal trouble when it aired on television. Authorities took notice, and Tony was fined, adding yet another chapter to his already wild reputation. But despite the setbacks, he kept pushing forward. A race against time now. With winter closing in, Tony had one mission: get the trommel running before the deep freeze hits. This was no small task. The machine had been abandoned for decades, and no one knew just how much work it needed. Tony wasn't just a tough miner. He was a smart businessman who understood the importance of staying ahead. His investment in the trommel and a custom-built excavator showed his commitment to building a mining empire that could last. He wasn't chasing short-term wins. He was thinking long-term, even if it meant taking huge risks along the way. Bringing the beast back to life. Getting the trommel to camp was just the first step. Now, it had to be rebuilt from the ground up. Every bolt, every joint, every mechanical part had to be checked and repaired. Tony brought in his best mechanics to inspect every inch of the machine. They replaced worn-out belts, rusted gears, and even upgraded key parts to improve efficiency. It was a painstaking process that took weeks, but rushing it would have only led to disaster later. No time to waste. While the trommel was being restored, Tony couldn't just sit and wait. His old dredges were still causing problems, and with winter fast approaching, he had to make some tough calls. Tony Beets' last-ditch gamble. Will it pay off? Tony made a tough call. Dredge number 1 was going on hold. It just wasn't bringing in enough gold to justify the constant repairs and rising costs. Instead, he shifted his entire focus to getting the Trommel up and running before the brutal Yukon winter set in. And time was running out. When winter hits, temperatures plummet, the ground turns rock solid, and mining grinds to a halt. If the Trommel wasn't operational before the first heavy snowfall, Tony and his crew could lose an entire season, a mistake they couldn't afford. The pressure was on, and everyone felt it. Days blurred into nights as the crew worked non-stop, welding, grinding, and assembling the massive machine. Sparks flew, engines roared, and exhaustion set in. But they couldn't slow down now. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the Trommel was ready. Moment of truth. The towering machine stood over camp, its massive drum gleaming under the pale Yukon sun. This was it. The team gathered, knowing everything was riding on this test run. If the Trommel failed, it wouldn't just be a financial disaster. It would crush morale. With a signal from the foreman, the operator fired up the engine. The Trommel rumbled to life, its drum slowly starting to turn. Conveyor belts clanked, the sluice box rattled, and the first batch of dirt was fed into the machine. Everyone held their breath. Minutes passed. Then, it happened. A glimmer of gold appeared in the sluice box. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The camp erupted in cheers, and for the first time in a long while, Tony allowed himself a smile. The Trommel worked, and it was about to change everything. A mining game changer. With no time to waste, Tony moved the Trommel to one of the most promising spots on his claim, an area that had been impossible to reach with the dredges. Now, with a mobile machine, they could mine where they never could before. The results? Unreal. The Trommel processed material faster than anything they'd ever used. Dirt piles turned into gold piles, and morale soared. Tony, never one to settle, pushed harder. He brought in excavators, loaders, and more equipment to keep the Trommel fed around the clock. The operation became a gold mining machine, running like clockwork. But in the Yukon, nothing ever stays smooth for long. Disaster strikes. Just when things were looking up, trouble hit, hard. A grinding metallic noise echoed from the Trommel. Something was wrong. Tony's heart sank. They shut the machine down immediately and called in the mechanics. After hours of inspection, they found the problem. A bad bearing was causing the drum to fall out of alignment. It was a serious issue. Every hour the Trommel was down meant lost gold, and with winter creeping closer, they couldn't afford a single delay. Tony didn't hesitate. Replacement parts were coming in by helicopter. It was an insanely expensive move, but there was no other choice. A race against time. The replacement parts finally arrived, and the crew wasted no time getting to work. Every second counted as they pushed themselves to get the Trommel running again. The tension in the camp was thick, but failure wasn't an option. Once again, they pulled through. The Trommel roared back to life, and just like that, the operation was back on track. As the season wound down, the prospector took a step back to reflect on everything they had accomplished. It had been a season full of challenges, breakdowns, setbacks, moments where it felt like everything could fall apart. But through it all, they had persevered. And the results? Undeniable. The Trommel had delivered. The Yukon miner knew that this was just the beginning. Next season? Even bigger. With the lessons learned and the experience gained, the future looked promising. Parker Schnabel's big gamble. While Tony pushed forward at Nugget Creek, over at Dominion Creek, Parker Schnabel was making a high-stakes bet, one that could bring massive rewards or crippling failure. The new claim had already made him serious cash in just a few days. But don't let the gold glitz and flashy headlines fool you. This season had been a roller coaster of struggles, misfires, and mechanical breakdowns. And now, everything was riding on this claim. The money pit cut. Make or break, Parker's crew was grinding hard, clearing ditches and running dirt through the wash plant. The goal? Maximize every ounce they could get. But this wasn't just about today's gold haul. Parker was building something bigger, a stable, long-term mining setup that wouldn't collapse under pressure. Things were finally starting to look up, but they hadn't started that way. The season kicked off as a complete mess. Parker had spent millions on the new claim, hoping it would turn his season around. Part of the plan? Sell off extra equipment to recoup some of the costs and create a quick cash flow. Spoiler alert, it didn't go as planned. Under pressure. With stress levels through the roof, Parker had to make some tough calls. Desperate times called for desperate measures, so he put Mitch in charge of hauling gold-rich dirt from the money pit. It was a grueling job, but if they wanted to see if this land was worth the hype, they had no choice. After 2 days of non-stop work, the new wash plant was finally up and running. The team was on edge. They had poured everything into this setup. And now it was time to see if it would pay off. And just when they needed it most, it all fell apart. Disaster at the wash plant. The wash plant suddenly lost water pressure, and everything shut down. No water meant no gold. No gold meant no payday. For Parker, this was a nightmare scenario, especially since the plant had just started showing promise. Liam and Tyler, the team's go-to mechanics, jumped into action. After hours of troubleshooting, they finally found the culprit. A fractured intake hose was letting in air, creating a lock in the system and killing the water pressure. Without pressure, the pump was useless. And without a pump, the whole operation was at a standstill. Would Parker fix the issue in time to save the season? Or was this claim about to turn into his biggest mistake yet? One thing was for sure. Gold mining in the Yukon never comes easy. A desperate fix and high stakes. Liam figured a quick silicone patch might do the trick, at least for now. It wasn't a perfect solution, but there was no time for perfection. Every minute the plant sat idle was money down the drain. With the wash plant finally back online, all eyes were on whether this gamble would pay off. Parker had already sunk $15 million into the Dominion Creek venture, and he was desperate to see a return. It wasn't just about getting the plant running, it had to start producing gold, or this entire season could be a massive failure. The crew pushed through 2 weigh-ins, the last haul from the Unforgiven Cut, and the first from Dominion Creek. It was a tense moment, but then the results came in. Dominion Creek was yielding about 1.3 ounces per hour, a promising start. Maybe this land was worth the struggle after all. But as always, gold mining is never easy. Another setback just as momentum started building, another issue threw everything off track. Tyson's crew had been pushing hard, making impressive progress, until the water supply ran into trouble, shutting down operations yet again. It felt like every time they took a step forward, something pulled them back. And then there was the looming big decision: what to do with the wash plant. The operation lead was considering selling it off. It only had 1,000 hours of use and was worth about $1 million, a tempting way to recoup some of the massive costs. But Parker wasn't ready to make that call just yet. He had bigger problems to deal with, like whether Dominion Creek would actually deliver. a risky move in Bolivia. Meanwhile, Parker found himself in Bolivia, checking out a high-risk gold mining operation at the Golden Eagles Cooperative. The 32 mine owners there claimed they were pulling in half a kilogram of gold per month, but something felt off. From an outsider's perspective, it looked like the actual output was at least 4 times higher than what they were admitting. And this wasn't just about numbers. If Parker could get in on this, it could mean big money. The Bolivian miners were working with old-school equipment using a wooden gravimetric gold table, similar to what Parker's crew used back in the Yukon. But there was a big problem. They were still using mercury to extract gold. That's a serious hazard. It's not just touching mercury that's dangerous, it's the fumes, especially when burned, that can cause severe health issues. Despite the risks, Parker saw potential. If outside investment could modernize their techniques, this operation could become a lot more efficient. But after watching their process firsthand, reality hit hard. They processed nearly 1,000 yards of dirt, only to pull out a disappointing 3.2 ounces of gold. Not worth it. This was the harsh reality of small-scale mining. Low yields, little profit, too many people splitting the gold. With 32 owners sharing tiny returns, Parker quickly realized this wasn't the kind of project worth his time. He wasn't after small wins. He wanted thousands of ounces, not scraps that barely covered expenses. It was clear this wasn't a venture worth sticking with. Back to Dominion Creek. High stakes, high risk. Back in the Yukon, time and money were running out. Parker and his crew had to move Lucy, the wash plant, into position on a steep hillside. One wrong move, and they could destroy the equipment, or worse, derail the entire season. The crew was on edge, but after some careful maneuvering, they got Lucy where she needed to be. Finally, after weeks of setbacks, they were ready to start processing dirt. For 2 straight days, they ran the plant, hoping for a solid payoff. Then came the moment of truth, the weigh-in. The results are in. The final gold haul, 125 ounces, about $250,000. Not a bad start, but also not enough to hit the lofty season goals. Now, the pressure was on more than ever. The question remained, could Parker turn this around? Or was disaster waiting just around the corner? What do you think? Will Parker's luck hold out? Or is he on the edge of a financial disaster? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more intense updates from Dominion Creek.